All right, welcome to our Wednesday evening Bible class. We are in Exodus chapter 13 tonight. If you've been a part of this study, you know that it is a chronological study through the Bible. We're trying to follow a timeline so that all of the different accounts continue in their proper context. It makes it a little easier to understand everything that's going on. And in the current chapter, where we are in Exodus chapter 13, where we are is the Israelites have been in Egyptian captivity for some 430 years, and Moses has been sent back by God and to lead them out. But of course, we know the account, and he's already been told Pharaoh's not going to listen. And so, as a result of that stubbornness by Pharaoh, Moses, by God's power, does the plagues. And in our most recent class, there were a couple of significant things that came out, and it had to do with that 10th plague being the death of the firstborn. And God had given the descendants of Abraham specific instructions of how to avoid the plague. Now, you remember, in the beginning, the plagues were on everybody. But then abruptly it changed, where the plagues were on Egypt but not on the Israelites. But the 10th plague is unique in that they had a choice as to whether or not the plague would be on them or not. If they didn't do what God asked them to do, then the Israelites would receive the same plague that the Egyptians did. And so God told them specifically about this lamb that they would select, or goat, 1 year old, on the 10th day of the first month, which he changed their calendar to make that their first month. And then on the 14th day, they would kill that lamb. They would sacrifice it. They would cook it. Specifically by God's instructions. They would put the blood on the doorpost, the lintel of their houses, and they had to stay inside the house. They were to eat all of the lamb. If it was too much lamb for one family, then they could join with another family, but they had to stay in the house. They ate it all that night, no leftovers. They were not to have leaven in their homes, and they were to be prepared to travel, have on their traveling garments, their belt, their sandals, and their staff in their hands, so that they would be ready to leave immediately. And there was also a feast that was a 7-day feast that was to be connected to that. And all of it had to do with remembering. When they walked out, they had to remember God. And that's going to come up in chapter 13 today as well. As we ended chapter 12, we read about, the Egyptians, the neighbors of the Israelites, gave them precious stones and gold and things of that nature. And then God led them out that night. At Pharaoh's wish, he finally gave in and said, you can go, and there's no compromise and there's no restrictions, you just go. And of course, God led them out. Now that starts us in chapter 13.
Yeah, I think you covered everything.
Okay. Exodus chapter 13, verse 1. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, sanctify to me all the firstborn, whatever opens the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and animal, it is mine. Now, there's a principle being established right here in this first statement in chapter 13 to Moses. And by the way, I don't believe here, based on what we're going to read next, that the text actually tells us everything that God told Moses here. It's just kind of a summary that God spoke to Moses and said, what I want to happen is have the firstborn sanctified. And what's not recorded that Moses will tell the people is that there were specific details on how to do that. But this is significant because it's setting a foundation for what's going to become their law. When they get to Mount Sinai and God gives them this law, a principle based on that law is that God has to be first. And so everything that they possess, everything that comes into their existence, even a child born or whatever, everything that is first goes to God. And the reason that he is establishing that principle, you learn as you continue through the Old Testament account, the reason he's establishing that is so that they learn to depend upon him. If you are, for example, raising sheep and the first one born, well, that's adding to your herd, and so you're going to use that to continue to reproduce and grow and take care of your family. But if you sacrifice the first one to God, then you don't have a backup plan. You have to depend upon the fact that God has said he'll take care of you, and there'll be a second lamb. And the same thing is true with the crops and everything. If they brought the first of their crops to God, then they have to trust that God has said he'll take care of them, and there'll be a second set of harvest or whatever that they can that they can live off of. So this principle is going to continue on, and certainly applies to us in the New Testament when in Matthew 6:33 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says to seek God and his kingdom first, and God will take care of the rest of it. Obviously a paraphrase, but if we recognize that God and the church has to be first, and God will provide for us, then we're trusting in him. And that principle starts here with this regulation on the first one.
And God doesn't specifically say that this is sacrifice. He uses the words consecrate or sanctify, but you can easily see the parallel in these allusions that lead to the Mosaic law. Also, you can tell that God is continuing with the three-word phrase of, it is mine, something we can trace back all the way to when he first instructed Moses to talk to Pharaoh, that these are my people. Again, saying that he is responsible for them. They don't belong to anybody. They don't belong to themselves. And that God is responsible for rescuing them.
All right, verse 3. And Moses said to the people, so now he's delivering this message from God to the people. This is why I said that about there was more than just what was recorded there from God. Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you're going out in the month Abib. And it shall be, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all of your quarters. Now let's stop there just for a second. So Moses turns to the people, and then he gives them the instructions that God has given to him, and it specifically has to do with remembrance. You know, this day that they have been through, where death has entered into Egypt and the firstborn has been taken. Now, as they're exiting, okay, that's fresh on their minds. But the problem is, there are going to be many days before they enter into the promised land, and so it's going to be very easy to forget over time. It's kind of like, you know, I don't know how many of the listeners have been on a mission trip or traveled to a different country that was maybe an impoverished area they were in, and as you go in, you start to realize just how you've taken things for granted in your life, maybe. The things that you have, you know, just kind of presumed will always be there when you exist for a time without them, they kind of mean different. Like, for example, I remember the very first time that I went into Peru, the one thing that I missed, I was only there a week, and the one thing that I missed more than anything else was ice. Because we're not supposed to have ice in our drinks because they make it with water that is not the same purity as we have here, and certainly has a different set of germs than the ones that my body is used to in the United States. And so that's a very quick way to get sick, is by drinking a drink that has ice made from water from that other country. And I remember at the end of that, I was thinking, I just want to get home to get ice. And I remember getting home, and that first cup of iced tea or whatever it was that I drank, even ice water, I was just so good. But how many days do you think that it took for me to just kind of take that for granted again? You know, because ice was always available to me here. And that's the way God's warning them about that. Don't be a people right now, while this is fresh on your mind and you know what God has done for you. Here's this memorial. It's going to happen the same way every year. You're going to have this day of Passover. You're going to have this 7 days of no unleavened bread or no leavening in your house. It's all going to be all unleavened bread. And the purpose of that is so that you won't forget.
Yeah. I find it like extremely symbolic that following the blood sacrifice of the lamb, they're asked to walk in purity. This idea that they are eating only unleavened bread, leavening, of course, representing temptation and sin and all that is wrong. They're asked to walk in strictly purity, the unleavened bread. But it's not sad or depressing as you might imagine it, because it begins and ends with a feast. It begins and ends with a party, so that there's this joy with walking with the Lord.
And now we connect further all of that purity that God's making them, and you realize that what he's saying is, this is the next step in the fulfillment of my promise. You had to stay in a particular place to get this far. Now you have to stay in a particular place to keep going. And you remember, if you've been through this study with us in the leading up to even this time of quarantine when we had to start doing the video classes, You remember the promise that was made to Abraham about this land of Canaan. And you remember even as Joseph is in Egypt and Jacob is finally going down with the rest of the family, he stops before he leaves Canaan. And he says, and God says to him, don't be afraid. Go on down because I will bring them back. But that was a long time, 430 years between that promise and when they finally do actually come back. And so this next step is not going to be quick either. It could have been, but God knew that they were not going to follow him, at least wholeheartedly, not going to trust him. They didn't have faith yet to do that. And so it was going to take some time, but they had to be pure.
Yeah.
All right, let's start reading again in verse 8. And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up out of Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand, and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. So now they get a why. Here's why. God has told them specifically what to do, and now he says why. And why is because the next generation needs to know. They need to pass this down successively through generations. It's the same requirement that we have today. And he says specifically, and by the way, there's an example here that of how sometimes we abuse what God says. Like what they're told to do is to make sure and keep this as a memory. And he uses as a kind of example of that, like something you'd put on the back of your hand or on your forehead, meaning it's always there. And so by the time of Jesus, there were people walking around with these things called phylacteries, these little fancy boxes of things or pouches where they would put scripture in them and wear them on their heads or on their hands. And they thought that made them somehow super spiritual because they were doing this. But this is not a literal statement of what they're to wear. It's an example of what they are to remember. And the reason you know that is because he says it will be in your mouth. So it was about remembering it so that they tell it, not about a literal pouch or something that they would wear on their head. The important thing was that they remember what God did and they pass it to the next generation. Now what we'll know is at some point that stopped happening. And we know that because by the time we get to the account of Judges, the first part, what we learn in the early part of the book of Judges is when they entered into the land and God gave them this land, just like Joshua had warned them, once he died and those elders who were serving with him also died, the next generation did whatever was right in their own eyes. So it didn't get passed down. It got forgotten. And that's the same thing that's happened in the religious world today. So much division exists because somewhere along the way, people quit passing down truths. And as a consequence of that, they forgot God. And so God's saying it's significant here. You have to remember this feast and this Passover day, and you've got to teach your kids about it because it goes to the next generation.
Yes, the Pharisees took the idea of phylacteries and made it very a legalistic thing, but I find the symbolism of like hands, eyes, and mouth, or hands between your eyes, your mind, and mouth, like very powerful. Like it's your hands, it's what you do. It's between your eyes, it's what's on your mind, and it's your mouth, what you say. And that last one being extremely specific in this scenario because they don't know it yet. But the people that Moses is talking to right now won't be there when they get to Canaan. And that's why it's so important that God is giving them this example here that everything you say, do, and think should reflect the law because you need to pass this on.
Because without that, you can't pass it on.
Right.
You can say something to your kids, but if you're not doing it and dwelling on it, they're not going to care what you say. And the same thing is true with them. That's a good point. All right. Verse 11. And it shall be, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, that you shall set apart to the Lord all that open the womb, that is, every firstling that comes from an animal which you have, the males shall be the Lord's. But every firstling of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, then you shall break its neck. And all the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. So we'll stop there just a second. And what we're dealing with now is, again, another aspect of this remembrance. And also another aspect of looking forward. So you have the remembrance being the firstborn. This is an explanation of what it meant, the firstborn belonging to God. The first male that was born was to be sacrificed, but specifically, he identifies two separate categories after that. One of them had to do with the donkey. And so you wonder, why in the world what's the deal? If you're going to sacrifice a lamb or give that to God, why not give him the donkey as well? And the point is, the donkey is an unclean animal. Now, at this point, that hasn't been designated yet, but it will be as the law is presented to them. The law will state what is unclean and what is clean. And God will not take the unclean sacrifice. And so what they have to do to that one is they have to redeem it with another animal, a lamb that God will accept. And it goes back to this idea of purity that Rich was talking about just a moment ago. The unclean animal would not be a pure sacrifice. And then you get to the child. Well, obviously a human sacrifice is not acceptable to God, and that will be stated so many times, and they'll actually be condemned for that at times when they did practice it. But in Numbers chapter 18, what we're told is how that redemption of the child happens, and it happens by 5 shekels of silver. So it's basically, I guess you might call it a tax. They were required to go with the tax. And by the way, you see that even at the birth of Jesus, after he is later taken after his birth into the temple, remember? And there was Simeon there, the old the old priest who was waiting for God's redemption to show up, God's Messiah. And it's finally that day that he sees this Messiah, this child born, and he says, now I can die in peace. And what they were doing there is they were redeeming him. Now, of course, it wasn't because of his sin. It was because of them. They were to redeem their firstborn. But that all is fulfilled in the fact that this Messiah shows up, and he's the Lamb that redeems all of us.
I don't know why it continues to amaze me, but every time I come across a passage where God is instituting a physical reminder for something spiritual, it always reminds me of how well God knows us as humans. Because when you read this, it begins with, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites. When you go to Canaan, and he's already assuming by that point, they're going to need a physical reminder of what God did for them. And in the same way God institutes us the Lord's Supper, and he's done this throughout the Bible, and pretty much every generation that he's dealt with, he gives them a physical reminder of what he's done for them. And I always find it amazing how well God knows that we need these physical reminders in our life.
We respond to visual
yes.
and senses and everything. Okay, verse 14. So it shall be, when your son asks you in time to come, saying, what is this? Now, we've seen that before about passing it down, right? The kids won't know. They're going to ask, tell me about this. What is this? That you shall say to them, by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh was stubborn, we've talked about that a few times, stubborn about letting us go, that the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animal. Therefore I sacrificed to the Lord all males that opened the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a sign on your hand and as frontlets between your eyes, for by strength of hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. So again, we get a why. Why do we sacrifice the firstborn? Why do we have this animal? Which, by the way, I didn't mention a minute ago, but the donkey that they had to redeem by something else. If you weren't willing to redeem it, you had to kill it. You know, so you didn't get it either way. Only way you could receive the blessing is if you sacrificed the lamb. That's what could happen. But why do you do that? Why do you pay this tax or whatever it is for the firstborn male child? And the answer is because they need to remember what God did. And it was a violent night, by the way. I mean, I think the parallel that God was getting across is, you know, sin is no small matter. Even today, you get into the New Testament, and we think about we're living in this time of God's extraordinary grace and mercy, which they had extreme grace as well. It just seems to be that we focus on it maybe different at this point because we don't have the sacrifices that had to be made under the old law of all the animals and everything. So we don't see the violence, but that doesn't make sin any less violent. And that's why, as Rich was just talking about with the Lord's Supper, we remember every first day of the week the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, because that death was violent. And the reason it had to happen that way is because that's how sin is. Sin is such a destructive force, not only in our world, but in our own individual lives. And the only way we can be redeemed back is by the blood of Jesus. So he's telling them why under the law, or what will be the law, under their direction as they leave Egypt, that they're supposed to do all these things so that the next generation remembers why.
God is creating an opportunity for a conversation within the home between like a parent and child. And I remember when I was a kid, obviously I'm young, I'm sorry, but after 9/11, the following day after 9/11, all of the Cartoon Networks didn't show anything. It was a black screen all day, Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, Disney Channel, and it was an opportunity for parents or kids to go to their parents and ask, why is this happening, to create a conversation within the home. And God is instituting a very similar thing here. He's presenting them with this thing to do for the opportunity for a child to ask his father or his mother, why do we do this? And to create that conversation so that they can pass it on.
Yeah. And then they'll do it with the next generation. Yeah. All right, verse 17. And then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Now, we stop there just a second, and I think we see again, and Rich has brought this up earlier, about how much God knows about us. You know, God knew before it started, when he sent Moses back, he knew that the people were not ready. And so this is the Pharaoh who by God's sovereignty is in power that would be stubborn enough to need those plagues. That's what it would take to actually get these people to follow Moses. But then when they go out, it's not like they're going out and just running quickly to this promised land. They're going kind of southeast instead of northeast. And the reason is because God knows what's going to happen. I mean, you think about it, and I know I'm getting ahead of the account here, but we already know that there are multiple times when they get out here in the wilderness that they say things like, why did you bring us out here to die? We had it pretty good back in Egypt. So they wanted to go back many times, even without war. So how's it going to seem if they go from being these captives, these slaves in Egypt, and they rush off to freedom, and the first thing that happens is they're faced with war? They're not going to have the courage that it's going to take to continue on. They're just going to turn around and leave. In fact, they're going to be at Mount Sinai for about 2 years getting this law and setting everything up. And then only 11 days from there, they go to Canaan, and that's where they send the spies in. And the spies come back and say, we can't even do it now. So years later, they're still struggling with this. God knows who they are.
Yeah, God knows exactly how they react to conflict. And if you just read a couple chapters ahead, you realize that the second they get thirsty, they're ready to go back. They're like, well, at least we weren't thirsty as slaves.
Maybe they needed ice.
Yeah, they needed more ice. But God knows throwing them into a war zone, they will definitely run back. So it's just, again, God's all-knowing power that he knows his people.
Yeah, and he's doing what's best for them.
Yeah.
All right, 18. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Oh wait, I wanted to bring something up there. I started to keep reading, but I want to bring something up. You would think that if you try to put yourself in their shoes, you know, try to understand their circumstances, and that's always the best way to understand an account. If you're there, you have spent your entire life. There is nobody who is leaving Egypt on this night who has been anything other than a slave of Egypt. Okay? They were born in slavery, just like Moses was. They had lived their whole life in slavery, and now all of a sudden they have freedom. You would think it would almost just be, you know, like opening up the gates to Disney World, and everybody's just running in chaotically trying to get to the place where they want to be and everything. But that text says they go out orderly. That's because these people have started to learn a little bit about God, and now they've headed out into a somewhat scary journey where they've never been, where they don't know what's ahead, they don't know how to endure it, they don't even know how to take care of themselves, and they've got Moses leading them by God's direction, and so they're in orderly fashion are headed out into Egypt, into the wilderness.
Yeah, and again, you can automatically see that God is not taking them the most direct route. Even to get to Sinai, assuming we know where the Red Sea is, that's not the best way to get there. God's taking them to an open body of water that they're going to have to cross. So God is already setting something up to prove his power to them.
Yeah, leading them to a test.
Yeah.
All right, 19. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oaths, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. So we remember back to the account earlier. Again, if you've been a part of this class before the recent pandemic, you were here at the church building, and we studied through the latter part of Genesis. You know, and even the early part of Exodus, you know that as Joseph's life ended, he gave a command to his family, and that was, don't leave me here. But it was many generations later. And so his bones were somewhere in Egypt in a coffin, waiting for these people to be freed by God, and he to be carried out of this land to Canaan with them. And that's interesting because I see a reminder. And they had that reminder, and they did pass it down. You can imagine somebody's child saying, you know, what's this box here for? Why do we keep Joseph here? Why don't we bury him or whatever? Who even is Joseph? And the people, the parents or the adults would have the chance to explain it and explain God's going to come get us. And this is a statement of faith. God's going to come get us. And when he does, we're going to take Joseph's bones with us out of Egypt.
Yeah, it's powerful how God uses different tactics to remind us of things. Because when you look at Jesus in the New Testament, he's speaking in metaphors and parables, because that's what the people in that period needed. But the Israelites, or the soon-to-be Israelites right here, needed physical, literal reminders. So that when Joseph said, "You will take my bones away," that wasn't a metaphor to you will go to a better place. That meant you will look at my bones every day as you walk by my coffin, wherever it's being stored. And remember that you're going to grab me when God comes to you.
Yeah, and undoubtedly it was in some kind of a public place because that was prepared for them to go out. I mean, you don't stick it back in storage and forget about it. It stays there if you do that. All right, verse 20. So they took their journey from Succoth and camped in Etham at the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Now, there's some research into this pillar idea. You know, all of my life I've kind of pictured this as like a tornado. I grew up in Missouri, and there are a lot of tornadoes that go across through Missouri and Arkansas and Tennessee, Kentucky, Oklahoma, you know, all that area. And so I've seen them. And if you live down here in South Florida, you've probably seen water spouts, similar idea. And so you kind of picture this tornado going along in front of them, and they're just kind of following along. Yet the wording kind of suggests a little bit more than that. It kind of even suggests a covering. And in fact, when you get over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that's one of the things that Paul will refer back to is when they go through the sea, and very soon that will happen. When they go through the sea, they were in the cloud, or the cloud was covering them. They had the water all around them, so it's a covering. So it's not just, you know, they've got this dust devil or tornado or whatever in front of them that they're following. It's that God is still protecting them and providing them. You can imagine the heat of the wilderness in the daytime and the cold of the night. If you've ever been in a desert type of area or wilderness type of area with no protection, you can imagine the difficulties. So God is accomplishing his guidance to take them where they're supposed to be, because they don't have a GPS. They've got God. He's given them this guidance, and at the same time, he's giving them shelter and protection and provision so that they will be taken care of. And in a little while, it's going to be a barrier even between them and their captors, their enemies.
I don't have much to add here other than the fact that this is the most intimate God has been with humans since the garden. And I just find that like telling of what relationship is going to develop from this point on.
Okay, that's all we have to cover tonight. We will pick up there in chapter 14 again for next Wednesday night, and we'll close this class with a prayer.
Pray with me. Dear Lord, our Father, we are so thankful that we have your word, that we have this gift you have given to us to guide us in our understanding of you, how you work, your nature, Lord. We ask you to be with us as we study it, that as we look into the Bible, your gift to us, we can see ourselves in both the right and the wrong, that we can see ways that we can correct our lives to live for you, that we can use this to guide others closer to you. God, we ask you to be with us always, that you continue to keep us safe in this uncertain time, that you continue to love us, and that you continue to use us for your mission. It's in your Son's holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.